Columbus arrived in 1492, but someone else had already been there and left their DNA in the bodies of people living on the American continent, encoded in a genetic signal that no amount of time could erase. We know exactly which people did it. We know roughly when. And the evidence is so solid that it was published in Nature, confirmed by chicken bones, and backed by a second independent study of 15 ancient skeletons pulled from one of the most isolated islands on Earth. The Polynesians reached the Americas centuries before any European ship pointed its bow west, and their DNA, still sitting in the genomes of living people today, is the proof that the history books got wrong. This is the story of the greatest ocean crossing in human history. Not Columbus, not the Vikings. The people who did it with no metal, no compass, and no maps, navigating 10 million square miles of open Pacific in wooden canoes, guided by nothing but memory, starlight, and the shape of waves beneath them. And this is the story of how DNA, molecule by molecule, finally rewrote what we thought we knew. Start with the ocean itself. Draw a triangle on any map and connect 3 points. Hawaii in the north, Rapa Nui in the southeast, and Aotearoa, New Zealand in the southwest. That triangle outlines more than 10 million square miles of open water. More space than Europe, Asia, and Africa combined. The nearest corners of that triangle are separated by close to 3,000 miles. Some individual legs of Polynesian voyaging stretched for weeks at sea with no land in sight. And yet, over 1,000 islands inside and beyond that triangle were settled, each one reached by deliberate human choice, not by accident or drift. The scale of what these people accomplished does not shrink the more you look at it. It grows. For a long time, the world underestimated how this was possible. The comfortable theory, the one that Europeans proposed when they first encountered Pacific Islanders and struggled to accept what they were seeing, was that the islands had been settled by drift, people blown off course, pushed by currents, stumbling onto land by chance after months of helpless floating. It was a theory that said more about European assumptions than it did about Polynesian capability, and it has been completely destroyed by evidence. In 1976, a double-hulled voyaging canoe called Hokulea left the shores of Hawaii without a compass, without GPS, without a single metal navigation instrument, and sailed 2,500 miles to Tahiti using nothing but the traditional wayfinding methods of the Polynesian ancestors. The navigator on that first voyage was a man named Mau Piailug, a master navigator from the tiny Micronesian island of Sarawal, one of the last people on Earth still carrying the complete ancient system of navigation in his memory. Mau had learned it from his father, who had learned it from his father before him, an unbroken chain of transmitted knowledge that stretched back thousands of years. The voyage to Tahiti took 33 days. They hit their target precisely. No instruments, no second chances. The myth of accidental drift collapsed the moment Hokulea touched the Tahitian shore. What Mau Piailug carried in his memory was not a rough approximation of direction. It was a complete and sophisticated system. Polynesian navigators built a mental framework called the star compass, a memorized chart of more than 150 star rising and setting points, each one marking a precise bearing across the horizon. Hokulea's master navigator, Nainoa Thompson, trained directly by Mau Piailug and the first modern Polynesian to use traditional wayfinding for open ocean voyaging, later expanded the star compass framework to 32 directional houses along the horizon, each anchored to specific stars. When clouds blocked the sky, navigators switched to an entirely different system, tracking the feel of ocean swells against the hull of the canoe, reading the movement of the water beneath them to identify crossing currents, and the invisible shadows that islands cast in the patterns of waves miles before any land becomes visible. They tracked bird flight paths. They read the color of water. They watched cloud formations that formed differently above land than above open sea. Every single sense was a navigation instrument. The Pacific was not a barrier to these people. It was a road they knew better than the rest of the world knew its own streets. Since 1976, Hokulea has completed more than 100 open ocean voyages using traditional wayfinding alone. In 2023, Hokulea and her sister, Canoe Hiki and Alia, began an extraordinary multi-year circumnavigation of the entire Pacific, visiting more than 300 ports across dozens of countries and indigenous territories using nothing but the ancient methods. In March 2025, the Polynesian Voyaging Society marked the 50th anniversary of Hokulea's launch, celebrating half a century of living proof that Polynesian navigation was always what Polynesian people said it was: deliberate, precise, and repeatable across any distance the ocean offered. Now hold that image in your mind, the navigator at the stern, reading stars and swells in the dark before dawn, and ask where that system of knowledge came from. Who were these people before they became the greatest ocean voyagers in human history? The answer came from the bones. But before it came from the bones, it came from one more piece of evidence worth understanding. The direction of Polynesian expansion across the Pacific was not random. When researchers map the genetic diversity of living Polynesian populations across the islands using modern sequencing techniques to compare hundreds of genomes from different communities, they find a pattern. Genetic diversity decreases as you move eastward, a classic signature of successive founding events, where each new island was settled by a small group from the previous one, carrying a slightly reduced sample of the total genetic variation. The trail of decreasing diversity moves east from Samoa through the Cook Islands to the Marquesas, and then fans out toward Hawaii, Rapa Nui, and New Zealand. The Marquesas emerge in multiple genetic studies as a critical hub, a place where diversity is still relatively high, and from which multiple further colonizations seem to have departed. And it is from the South Marquesas Islands that the 2020 DNA study dated the earliest point of contact with Native American ancestry, around 1150 CE, before the signal spread further east to Rapa Nui by around 1380 CE. The genetic geography tells a story of navigators departing from the Marquesas and pushing east, eventually crossing the remaining distance to the coast of South America, then carrying that contact signal back westward as they continued to move between islands. The DNA maps the voyages map the people. Ancient skeletons unearthed in Vanuatu and Tonga changed the picture entirely. These were the remains of people from the Lepite culture, the founding population from which all Polynesians are ultimately descended, and they were radiocarbon dated to between 3100 and 2300 years before the present. For decades, archaeologists and geneticists had argued about where the Lepita people had ultimately come from. Two main theories competed. The first, called the express train model, held that the Lepita had originated in Taiwan, or nearby East Asia, and swept rapidly eastward through the Pacific, with minimal mixing with the Melanesian populations already living in the region they passed through. The second theory argued that the genetic evidence from living Polynesians suggested a longer, more mixed history in Melanesia, a slow boat rather than an express train. The ancient DNA ended that debate. When scientists extracted genetic material from these Lepita bones and compared it to populations across the entire world, the results pointed in one direction with a clarity that no living population DNA had previously managed. The closest genetic relatives of the Lepita founders were not in Melanesia, not in Australia, not in any nearby Pacific group. They were in Taiwan, specifically among the Atayal and Kankanai peoples of Taiwan and the northern Philippines. The Lepita founders carried over 85% East Asian ancestry with almost no Papuan admixture in the earliest samples. A landmark 2016 ancient DNA study led by evolutionary biologist David Reich at Harvard University confirmed it formally. The Lepita people were essentially pure Southeast Asians of Taiwanese roots, who had moved through the Pacific rapidly without significant mixing with the Melanesian populations they passed. The Papuan ancestry seen in modern Polynesian genomes, the study concluded, entered the population later, about 2,500 years ago, as Papuans began joining the same voyaging networks that had carried Lapita settlers eastward. Archaeology and linguistics had pointed toward Taiwan for years. The ancient DNA sealed it beyond reasonable dispute. The express train from Taiwan was not a theory anymore. It was a molecular fact, encoded in bones nearly 3,000 years old. From Taiwan, the story moves east across thousands of years and thousands of miles. The Lepita culture reached Tonga and Samoa around 3,000 years ago. Then, somewhere between roughly 900 BCE and 700 CE, the voyaging slowed. A long stillness settled over the eastern Pacific. No new islands were colonized for hundreds of years. Archaeologists still debate what caused the pause, though some researchers point to a period of climatic instability that may have made long ocean passages less predictable and more dangerous. Others suggest that the populations establishing themselves in western Polynesia simply needed generations to grow large enough to send out founding groups. Whatever the reason, the pause was real and it lasted a long time. Then, almost without warning, the ocean highways opened again. Radiocarbon dating has sharpened the picture of what happened next into something that looks less like a gradual expansion and more like an explosion. Rarotonga in the Cook Islands shows human arrival around 830 CE, Tahiti and the Society Islands by roughly 1000 CE, Hawaii by around 1200 CE, Rapa Nui, the island the world calls Easter Island, by 1300 CE, New Zealand by somewhere between 1300 and 1350 CE. The Austral Islands, the Tuamotus, Mangareva, and dozens of smaller outposts all fall within the same tight window. The entire eastern Pacific, from the tropics to the cold waters of the far south, colonized in less than 5 centuries. Archaeologists have called this one of the most dramatic and concentrated bursts of migration in all of human history. More than 1,000 islands settled in a span of time shorter than the distance between Columbus and today. What drove the acceleration is still studied and debated. Advances in double-hulled canoe design almost certainly played a role. The double hull gave these vessels stability and carrying capacity that earlier designs could not match, allowing crews to bring animals, plants, fresh water, and enough supplies for founding a new community rather than simply surviving a crossing. The oral navigation systems were also highly refined by this period, passed from master to apprentice through a training process that demanded years of dedicated ocean time and the memorization of hundreds of star paths, current patterns, and seasonal wind shifts. The ancestors were doing this across dozens of generations, building a body of accumulated knowledge about the Pacific detailed enough to navigate it reliably in any direction. And right in the middle of that expansion, at the precise moment when Polynesian navigators were reaching the furthest edges of the known ocean, something happened that changed the story of two worlds at once. A 2020 study published in the journal Nature, led by Alexander Ioannidis of Stanford University and colleagues from institutions across the world, set out to answer one of the longest standing questions in Pacific archaeology. Had Polynesians made contact with the Americas before Europeans arrived? The team collected DNA samples from more than 800 people across 17 island groups throughout Polynesia, compared those genomes to genetic data from 15 Native American groups, including several from South and Central America. They also added a selection of pre-Columbian South American DNA samples specifically to control for any genetic mixing that might have occurred after European contact, since most modern Chilean and South American populations already carry European ancestry from the colonial era. The method they used to search for ancient contact was called identical by descent segment analysis, a technique that searches the genome for long, unbroken stretches of shared DNA that only appear when two populations have mixed within a relatively recent number of generations. Random shared ancestry from tens of thousands of years ago leaves only short, fragmented traces scattered across a genome. Recent mixing leaves long, unbroken segments intact, like a paragraph of text that has not yet been scrambled by time. The length of the surviving segments acts as a clock, ticking backward toward the moment of mixing. What the study found was unmistakable. People on multiple eastern Polynesian islands carried these long, unbroken segments of Native American DNA. Not just Rapa Nui, which sits closest to South America and had long been the focus of contact theories, but also people from the Marquesas Islands, Mangareva, Tahiti, Palliser, and other island groups further to the west. The Native American ancestry across these populations all pointed to a common source. Researchers traced it most specifically to ancestry linked to the Xenu people, a pre-Columbian culture from the Caribbean coast of northwestern Colombia, a people who built elaborate raised field systems across broad stretches of wetland landscape for flood control and agriculture. The genetic signal was not faint or ambiguous. It was the kind of signal that points to real people who crossed a real ocean and had children together. And the clock built into the length of those DNA segments gave an answer that had been unknown for centuries. The mixing happened at approximately 1200 CE, centuries before Columbus, centuries before Magellan, right at the peak of the greatest wave of Polynesian exploration the Pacific had ever seen. Think about what that means. At the same historical moment that wooden canoes were touching the shores of Hawaii and Rapa Nui for the first time, at least one group of Polynesian navigators kept going. They crossed the remaining distance between eastern Polynesia and the South American coastline, the longest unbroken ocean stretch on the surface of the planet, made contact with people living on that continent, and either returned with some of them or left a genetic legacy in the communities they found. The DNA carried by living people on multiple Pacific islands today is the direct record of that moment. It did not come from European contact. The study specifically excluded it. The Native American signal was already in the Polynesian genome before any Europeans set foot in either the Pacific or the Americas. Other evidence lined up alongside the genetics in a way that was impossible to dismiss. Linguists had long noted a striking similarity between the Quechua word for sweet potato in the Andes, which sounds like kumara or kumal, and the word used for sweet potato across Polynesia, where it is called kumara or kumala, depending on the island. Sweet potatoes were domesticated in South America. They were growing in Polynesia for centuries before any European ship crossed the Pacific. Someone brought them. The DNA study told us who and roughly when. Then came the chickens. At an archaeological site called El Arenal on the Arauco Peninsula of Chile, researchers uncovered a chicken bone and sent it for radiocarbon dating. The result came back between 1304 and 1424 CE, firmly within the pre-Columbian era, before any European had reached that coast. Ancient DNA extracted from the same bone matched a Polynesian mitochondrial haplogroup. Chickens are not native to the Americas. Someone brought them from Polynesia to Chile sometime in the 14th or early 15th century. The bone, the date, and the DNA together form a physical artifact of contact that no theory of coincidence can explain. And then, in September 2024, a study published in Nature by a team led by researchers from the University of Copenhagen added another layer of confirmation that fundamentally changed the terms of the debate. This study was different from all the previous ones because it did not rely on the DNA of living people. It used ancient DNA, extracted from the bones of 15 Rapa Nui individuals who had died between 1670 and 1950 CE. That distinction matters enormously. The DNA of living people today can be complicated by centuries of post-contact history, migration, colonial-era population movements, mixing that happened in ways that are difficult to disentangle from much earlier events. Ancient DNA from people who lived on Rapa Nui before or shortly after European arrival is a direct genetic window into what was already there before that contact began. The Copenhagen team radiocarbon dated all 15 individuals to establish their place in time, and then whole genome sequenced every one of them, producing the most complete ancient genetic portrait of Rapa Nui ever assembled. The results were published in the same issue of Nature alongside extensive supplementary analysis. What they found was confirmation in ancient bone of what the living DNA had already suggested. The ancient Rapa Nui people carried Native American admixture, and that admixture dated to the pre-European period. The contact between Polynesians and Native Americans was not a product of modern history. It was not introduced by ships that came after 1722, which is when the first European vessel arrived at Rapa Nui. It was embedded in the DNA of people who had already been living on that island for generations before European contact ever began. The same 2024 study also settled a second famous debate about Rapa Nui, one that had nothing to do with the Americas, but had shaped how the world understood this island for decades. For years, the most popular theory about Rapa Nui held that the island's population had collapsed catastrophically before Europeans arrived, the result of environmental destruction, deforestation, and overexploitation of resources by the Rapa Nui people themselves. This theory was widely repeated in best-selling books and popular documentaries as a cautionary tale about ecological overreach. The ancient DNA destroyed it. The genetic data showed no sign of a major population bottleneck, no genetic signature of catastrophic collapse in the pre-European period. The ancient individuals showed stable population structure without the sudden diversity loss that follows a severe collapse. What the DNA did show was the genetic impact of what happened after European contact: disease, violent raiding by slavers, and the forcible removal of large portions of the population. The Rapa Nui did not destroy themselves before Europeans arrived. The destruction came from outside. The DNA rewrote two entirely separate historical narratives in a single paper. So where does this leave the story of who discovered America? It leaves it exactly where the evidence places it. Polynesian navigators, using only stars, swells, bird paths, and memory, reached the coastline of South America sometime around 1200 CE. They made contact with at least one indigenous community there. That contact left a genetic trace in the bodies of living Polynesians on multiple islands, a trace confirmed in the ancient bones of Rapa Nui people who died before Europeans arrived, a trace supported by a pre-Columbian chicken bone in Chile whose DNA matches a Polynesian source, and a trace echoed in the matching words for sweet potato spoken on two sides of the world's largest ocean. The convergence of four completely independent lines of evidence, human genetics, ancient genetics, zooarchaeology, and historical linguistics, all pointing to the same time and the same people, is the kind of convergence that science rarely produces and that cannot be the result of coincidence. The debate is not fully closed. Some researchers continue to argue that the direction of contact is still uncertain, that it could have been Native Americans sailing west rather than Polynesians sailing east. The DNA cannot yet tell us with certainty which group did the actual traveling. But the physics of the Pacific strongly favors one direction. Polynesian canoes were designed for long ocean passage, built for weeks at sea, crewed by navigators who had mastered one of the most complex systems of maritime orientation in human history. The same wind and current patterns that Polynesian navigators had been using to cross the Pacific for centuries would have carried a canoe from eastern Polynesia toward the South American coast on a favorable route. The return trip, west against the prevailing winds and currents, is the harder direction, and the living legacy of that capability is still sailing today. Hokulea proved in 1976 what the ancestors proved centuries before. These voyages were not accidents. What the DNA has given us is something that no legend, no carved object, and no ruined stone platform could provide on its own: a biological timestamp. A moment, approximately 800 years ago, when a Polynesian canoe landed somewhere on the western edge of South America, and two populations that had been separated by the entire width of the Pacific Ocean for tens of thousands of years came face to face. We do not know the names of the people on that canoe. We do not know how many of them there were, how long they stayed, or exactly where they came ashore. What we know is that they were there, Their DNA says so. The DNA of people alive today on the Marquesas Islands, on Mangareva, on Rapa Nui, in the bones of men and women who died before any European ever crossed the Pacific, says so. A chicken bone in Chile, dated and genetically tested, says so. And a word for sweet potato, spoken in the same breath from the Andes to Hawaii, says so. Columbus arrived in 1492, and the world called it a discovery. The Polynesians arrived in the Americas around 1200 CE and brought back plants, left behind animals, and wove the genetic thread of two worlds together so completely that 800 years later, it is still readable in the DNA of their descendants. The ocean was never the barrier the world imagined it to be. For the people who read the stars and felt the swells beneath their hulls and knew exactly where they were going, the Pacific was always just the road home. What the full body of evidence now tells us is this. The original discovery of America was not a single event, but a process spanning many thousands of years, beginning when the first people crossed from Asia into the Americas, across what is now the Bering Land Bridge during the last Ice Age, and continuing in the deep past, with migrations that science is still tracing. But the Polynesian contact of around 1200 CE stands apart because it is the only known case of people from a separate hemisphere reaching the Americas and leaving a biological trace that we can read with precision. Not speculation, not legend. DNA in living bodies and in ancient bones, a chicken radiocarbon dated to before European arrival, and a food crop with a shared name on both sides of the world's largest ocean. 4 independent lines of evidence, 1 answer. The science is not finished. Researchers at UC San Diego are already looking for indigenous communities along the California coast, willing to share genetic samples to test whether Polynesian contact extended further north along the American coastline. The DNA signal that solved the question of contact in South America may be sitting undiscovered in populations further north, waiting for a scientist and a community willing to look together. And every new ancient genome sequenced from the Pacific, every new radiocarbon date from a Polynesian era site adds another data point to a map that is still being drawn. What boundary falls next is not a question with a certain answer yet, but the people who will answer it are using the same tools that proved what the ancestors accomplished. Precision, patience, and a willingness to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it rewrites the story the world thought it already knew.